little bit about me. I'm of Potawatomi descent. My mother was from up in northern Wisconsin, up in Forest County. My father was a Southside Chicago Polish guy. Yeah, I'm a Polish Indian. And he met her when he was in the CCCs, the Civilian Conservation Corps, in the 1930s. He was fortunate enough at the height of the Depression to get into the CCs, and was out in California and Idaho, and ended up in northern Wisconsin, met my mom, and as they say, that's all the rest is history. So I was fortunate, very fortunate to grow up with a great family up there, and was able to learn a lot about the culture. I've been blessed with everything I know. I'm not a full-blooded Indian, and I'm really glad I'm not, because I don't know if I'd have made it this far. I had trouble getting here just with what I've got. So I'm really kind of pleased, very pleased, to have been asked to speak here about this. This is really a unique program that they've got here going. You don't see this everywhere. There's a lot when you start talking about genocide, there's a lot that is so embarrassing that people want to just hide it. They want to stick it underground, under rocks, and just leave it be. And especially with us, we are the Native American epic is one of that greatly embarrasses the government. Even to this day, we have issues that continue.
And it should embarrass the rest of us.
Yeah, you know, it's kind of like, though, who do you get to say, yeah, okay, we get it, we understand? Because legislatures don't. They really don't. You see that going on right now. Right today, one of the hot button issues with woodland Indians, and that's what Potawatomi are, is a woodland Indian. Right now we've got an issue that's going up north with spearfishing rights that were granted in treaties. And back in the day, reservations were part and parcel of a form of genocide. It was like out of sight, out of mind. If you look at Native American reservations and think back when they were established, we were put out of sight. We were put in really crummy places where you couldn't grow crops. All through history, that just shows it. So that's just like the biggest and blatantest one. But the treaties that put us there were also really sad and badly handled. But I'll get into that a little bit more here. When I was approached about talking about this, I had to stop and think, what should I talk about? Because there's so much. And there's volumes, if you want to find it. There is an eminent French historian by the name of Emmanuel Leroy Ladurie. And Ladurie made the comment that historians come in two types. He said there are parachutists and truffle hunters. And a parachutist glides through history, glides over it, and sees what he wants to see. And a truffle hunter gets down and digs and looks for the rest of the story. So with that thought in mind, if you want to be a truffle hunter, you'll find volumes and volumes about what happened to us in just about any part of the country. Usually when you talk about genocide with Native people, everybody their minds go to the west or out to the Dakotas where Wounded Knee occurred and all that stuff. But we had it here on this side of the Mississippi River. So where to start? Native American history is very confusing. If you sit down and you think that it's going to be a simple thing, it's not. Tribes were divided, there were band chiefs, there was never, like with us, woodland Indian people, there was never one big chief. And that became a big issue with especially the United States government. They needed somebody to sign the treaties. Okay, Potawatomi hold the record for the number of treaties signed. We signed 46 treaties. I have a book with 43 of them in it. That's a record. And when you look at the chronology of it, for a while in the toward the early 1800s, they were coming at us every 2 years for another treaty. And it was all about land. It was all about what a lot of historians called manifest destiny. Yeah, what is it? Well, it was a phrase that was coined by a newspaper man on the East Coast. And basically what he meant by that was that it's God's will.
It means to be.
Yeah. See, all the way back to Pilgrim times. Okay, I'm going to kind of bounce around a little bit before I get into what I really want to talk about. But I got to lay a little groundwork for you. Back as early as 900s, late 900s, through 1100, we woodland people, Eastern Indians, were having contact with Europeans. This is a long time before your history books tell you about that guy that bumped into the island down south. A long time before he came along, we were having contact with Europeans. Part of that deals with the fact that there was a thing happening called the Little Ice Age. Anybody ever hear of that? The Little Ice Age? Little Ice Age. What the Little Ice Age was a change in the climate. In Europe, things got really bad. There's a lot of paintings that show that, where you see people out ice skating on ponds in Holland and stuff, and those ponds had never frozen before. Okay, we got this little ice age thing going on. We also have, at that time, a change in the temperatures of the different streams that flow out in the ocean. One of the staple foods for Europe was cod for hundreds of years. And sometimes people go, cod, how could that be? Well, how it could be was cod could be salted and stored away for a long duration. Sure, you had your cattle and your grains and all that stuff, but cod was really a specialty food, and it was controlled by certain countries, certain fishing groups. Amongst them was the Northmen, the Vikings, the Portuguese, the English, the Spanish. Those fishermen started to follow that change in the temperature and followed the cod, and as the cod moved, they moved with them. So they kept coming closer and closer to North America. So what happens when you're out off the Grand Banks and you're out there and you're all the way from Portugal and you're filling your holds with fish, but you got to go home? So you're going to come ashore. You got to get fresh water. You got to try and find staples, food, and stuff besides eating fish all the way. So we had contact with these guys, but we had no immunity to their diseases. And in Europe, disease was running rampant. You had Black Plague, you had smallpox, all that stuff going on. We didn't have that. And really, I know that this may sound like an oversimplification, but if a Viking sat down with a bunch of Indians to share a meal and he sneezed, a bunch of Indians would get sick and die. But really, it became such an
Infect
issue.
others.
Pardon me?
And infect others.
Oh, absolutely.
Please.
Yeah, we had no immunity to European disease. So, what happens with our people, the story of the migration of a great deal of woodland Indians into this Great Lakes area is a partial story of my people, the Potawatomi, as well as the Ojibwe and the Ottawa or Odawa. So what happens is we're out in the East Coast. We're up in the northeast coast of North America. And a lot of the ologists think that what was happening was these Norsemen, we were having contact with these Europeans, and sickness started. Our oral tradition gets us in trouble all the time because we didn't have books. We had oral tradition. We had stories that we passed to one another. I have stories that were passed to me by elders in my family and others that I know. And in our culture, we consider that a gift. Our oral tradition is a gift from our ancestors. When we do our little ceremonies and stuff, we always say thank you to the ancestors that sit in our way to the west. So here these guys are, and people start dying. So all the guys, all the elders, the guys that you might call chiefs, we didn't have that. They were called ogimas, and an ogima was a guy who had some kind of stature with the group. Usually, he was a good thinker. And I want to just deviate a little bit and say that with our people, they were so democratic, and that's what got us into trouble. Because they would sit around and talk all this stuff out. So they made according to our oral tradition, they make this big fire. They all sit around the fire and have this big discussion for several days. And they decide to get away from the sickness and death, that they're going to pack up and they're going to move to the west. Now this is a big undertaking. They're going to leave behind some of their people. They're going to leave behind a big issue for us. They're going to leave behind graves. They're going to leave behind their ancestors that are in the ground. But they decide that they have to do this to get away from this death and sickness. So for 7 years, according to our oral tradition, this big group of woodland Indians travels down the St. Lawrence River and eventually ends up here in the Great Lakes. Now, while they traveled, our oral tradition tells us that the Ojibwe were the keepers of the ceremonies. They were the keepers of the songs. Our songs aren't just music. Our songs are stories. Our songs are prayers. Are their acknowledgments. So that's their job. They're going to take care of all that stuff. The job of the Ottawa or Odawa people is going to be, they're going to be the wheeler dealers. They're going to be the traders. They're going to be the guys that are going to make friends as they travel. They're going to be all around good guys and make sure that there's supplies, there's good places for the people to camp, and so forth. The job of the Potawatomi, and that name is a European slur. We called ourselves Bodwatomi, and in general, all these tribes refer to each other as Anishinaabe. Anishinaabe is an Algonquian word that means first people, first guy to come down from up above. When we dance, and there's some guys here that dance. When we dance, we dance like this with our toes down. When men dance, they do toe and heel. That's out of respect to that original story where that first man was delivered by the Creator and the first thing that touched Mother Earth was his toes. That's why he does that. Okay, so their job, the Potawatomi, their job amongst the Anishinaabe is to be the keepers of the fire. Okay, go. Big deal, right? It was. It was a very big deal back then because fire being one of the four elements of life, we have to have it. We have to have water, we have to have earth, we have to have air, and we have to have fire. So here these guys come, and they're according to our oral tradition, they take some of these embers, and they carry these embers with them on this whole journey, and that's how they make fire. But also, in addition to them making the fire, they also supply warriors to guard that fire. Because if they come in contact with somebody that doesn't like their presence and it doesn't have fire, there's going to be a war for it. It's a necessity of life. So, you know, how do you get fire? You get fire from Mother Nature on a lightning strike. How else can you get fire? You make it. And so back then, yeah, there was no Bics, no Bic lighters, no good matches. It was all about rubbing sticks together. That's it. Everybody always says, yeah, you rub sticks together. Well, yeah, kind of we did, but what it was, we were a little bit more technologically advanced than just standing there with a couple of sticks. What it was called was a bow drill. It was a stick with some type of line attached to it, made either out of twine or leather. It was wrapped around, it was four parts. There was the drill part itself. There was a straight piece of hardwood that was hooked around, and then there was a hearth that it sat and rotated on, and then there was a piece of stone, usually, that you held on the top to push down to make friction, which is how you got the fire, right? The friction. So you were able to sit like this. You know, usually they did it squatting on the ground because you took one foot and held your hearth in place so it didn't leave you, and then you cranked. Well, that worked good. It worked good most of the time. But if you got out in really damp weather and you couldn't find good tinder and it's cold and snowing and stuff, that's a pretty hard way to make a fire. So what these guys did was they carried with them clam shells, and inside that clam shell was a growth from a tree that we refer to as shkatagan. And shkatagan was like punk, you know, when you were a kid and you lit firecrackers and you had your stick with the punk on it. That was the issue of the shkatagan. It was your punk. So you would take that and you would put a little spark in there, you blow on a little bit, and you put it in a clamshell and tie it closed. And you could stick that in your bag and carry it around for a couple of weeks. Occasionally you took it out and blew on it and gave it some oxygen, but you could keep it burning for a long time. So these guys carried these things with them when they traveled. They carried all the things that they used to make fire. And making fire for us is a spiritual experience because of its importance and the fact that it's a living, breathing thing. We today, when we do our ceremonies, that's how we start our ceremonial fires. We bring it to life. We use feathers to fan it, and we feed it gently. It's just like raising a baby. And that's what you're doing. You bring the life with the spark, and then you feed the fire, and you take care of it, you caress it, and you bring it to full life. So anyway, all of these guys came down here. When they got in the Great Lakes area, they spread out, they broke up into 3 groups. And everybody was doing really good for a long time until rumors spread about guys with hair in their faces, no offense to anybody with a beard or mustache, that had light skin and were traveling around, that had all kinds of fantastic technological advances. It was like getting a super cell phone, an iPhone, to have contact with these guys, because that's what that stuff was like that they had. And I'm talking about things made out of steel. One of the first things that they wanted to trade from the Europeans was a pot, so they could cook easier and not have to keep making birch bark containers to cook in, or pottered pots. They made, in this part of the country, they made pottery, but it was pretty bad stuff because the ground wasn't real good. And today, you know, if you go to an old village site and you're lucky enough, you can find bits and pieces of pottery there. And the reason that you don't find the whole thing is because the pottery was just bad. It was poor quality. Not like in the Southwest where they had that beautiful stuff. So, okay, we get here and we break up and we hook up with these guys, and then the whole show goes downhill. Around 1492, Columbus finds an island down to the south there, and he names it San Salvador, and proceeds to wipe out the Taino and Arawak tribes of people. Takes them completely out over a matter of years, using them as slaves in gold mines. Takes them out, completely gone. They have to go wandering off in the Caribbean and find other people to bring back to San Salvador to work the mines and stuff and do stuff for them. Now, how do we know that? We know that because, along with Columbus, were educated friars. Those guys were brown robes. Later on, we deal with the black robes. But these guys were all scribes. They wrote down everything that happened. They were the tape recorder of the day. Everything that went on, they jotted it down. And because these people looked on us, I gotta back up a little bit. Europeans, especially like the Pilgrim guys out in the East Coast, they looked on us as being devil people. We lived in the woods. That was a big thing. The dark of the woods was something that was scary in Europe. Okay? That's where bad things would happen to you, Hansel and Gretel, all that kind of stuff if you went in the woods. Wolves would get you, all that stuff. So they brought that fear with them. And actually, it was more than that. It was part of their scripture that the devil was out there lurking around. So if we're living in those woods and we're doing okay, there's got to be a hookup there somewhere. We got to be hooked into the devil. And we talk funny talk, and we dress weird, and all that stuff impacted them and connected us with the devil. Okay? By the way, I'll stop right here for a moment and say, in our culture, we don't have one of those guys. Okay? And we don't have hell as you know it. For us, this is hell. The trials and tribulations of life, the hills and valleys that we all go through, in our culture, we consider this hell. We look at the afterlife as being just one good happy place to go. Happy hunting grounds, if you want to reference that way. Okay, so around 1512, the Spanish government says, what we got to do, we can't keep using these guys as slaves because it's kind of like a sin for us to do that. Okay, and you got to remember how important religion was in Europe. At this time, you got the Spanish Inquisition going on. Everybody know about that? Yeah, that was a bad time. They were going out and getting their own people and burning them and torturing them and stuff. So, Spanish Inquisition's going on. They say, hey, wait a minute, we got all these slave guys down there. We can't be doing this. We have to pass a law and say it's legal. That takes us off the hook with God because all laws are, cleared through. And they did. They passed a law saying that using Indians, and of course Columbus coined that phrase, was okay. We made a law, it's okay. The bishops and all those guys said, go out there and have at it. So they took everybody off the hook. So when you got back to Spain, you wouldn't, somebody went, they wouldn't come around and grab you and haul you off to the tower somewhere. So, about this same time, you got guys coming here like De Soto down in Florida and into the south. He claims all that for them and then gets chased out of there by a bunch of Indians that don't want to buy his product. And that then infuriates the Spanish, and they come back in greater numbers and greater numbers, and more Indians are killed down there. They're killed so much that the original tribes that were down there at the time of De Soto ceased to exist. It creates a void where other Indians move down there from the north. Sir Walter Raleigh arrives around in the 1500s, late 1500s. And that guy, he returns to England. He takes corn, potatoes, tobacco, and Indians for show and tell. Goes back, that's the time of Queen Elizabeth I. If you want to get, now England's kind of poor at that time. They'd been through a series of wars and they didn't have a lot of loot. So what they were looking for was, they knew the Spanish were getting gold and silver, and they wanted a cash crop. They wanted something to get money. And so Raleigh goes to the Queen and says, look what I got. I got these things. We got these foods that we can plant. We can sell this stuff. We got tobacco, and we can get people hooked on it. They even, according to some stories, he lit up a pipe and gave it to the Queen. And she sat there and puffed on it for a while and gave her blessing. But he also brought these Indians, here, these people, check them out. And of course, those people that first got brought there ended up dying of disease. A couple, later on in history, a few of them make their way back. A guy named Squanto, and there's some of these guys that get lucky and are able to get back here to North America and become part of the mystique of the thing that you refer to as Thanksgiving. Now, the word Thanksgiving for us, we have like 7 of them a year, okay? So your version of Thanksgiving and our version of Thanksgiving are way two different things. The history, again, to go back to Leroy Ladurie, if you want to dig about the history of Thanksgiving, what that was all about, and those guys wrote it all down. It's out there. You can find it. You can read it. I'm not making it up. I used to give a talk over at Parkside to the students at Thanksgiving time, and it was entitled Rethinking Thanksgiving. Because when you really get in there and you dig a little bit, you go, this is nuts. The Thanksgiving we know today is a nice story. We, as Indian people, have no regrets to see people come together with their families and have a day of Thanksgiving. Not at all do we care. What we care about is that you dress your kids up in paper feathers and they run around their school going woo woo woo, and you know, and then if we say something, then they say, well, we're just trying to honor you. And you gotta go, wait a minute, you know, back up a little bit. Look at the real history of this thing. Those Englishmen at Plymouth invented, they didn't, the invention came during the Civil War of the Thanksgiving we all know and love. And it was done with a good heart, because you're right in the middle of the Civil War and families are torn apart and all that stuff's going on. And so this woman brought it to Lincoln and he went, yeah, that's cool, we'll do that. But the truth of the matter is that those English wanted those Indians that they invited to Thanksgiving Day, the first, it was to try to impress them, because they showed them their guns, they shot a lot, they fired a cannon, they did all this stuff, and they didn't have enough food. There was only 5 women, English women, that were there that were doing the cooking. There was 90 Indians and a head man, a chief, if you will, that showed up. Now think about this. At no time in history did Indians ever attack, purposefully go on the warpath with their families. Not too hard to comprehend, right? So who shows up for this gig? 90 men, warriors, and a headman. Ladies and gentlemen, that I call a war party. They didn't come there to just do warm fuzzies. They didn't know what to expect from these guys. So they came there loaded for bear. And when they saw that they didn't have enough food to feed them, they went out and started hunting deer and so on and so forth. And, you know, then we cut to 1862 and this lady invents the one we all know and love. Within a generation of that first Thanksgiving, the English are killing those same Indians. The descendants of those same Indians are being killed. The first war that happened was in 1670, where the English, today it's referred to as King Philip's War. And King Philip was the son of Massasoit, the guy that led a bunch of guys to Thanksgiving 1. It was this kid that was now the leader of their people. And they ended up killing him. And as in England, as in Europe, they cut his head off, stuck it on a pike pole, and paraded it up and down the East Coast at all the little settlements. And the warning was to the Indians, don't mess with us. In 1599, the Spanish killed over 800 Acoma Pueblo Indians. Over 800. This was in New Mexico. And then those 1600s, they had just, the English went goofy there. They did a systematic destruction of all the East Coast tribes. They just went, they just started wiping them all out. Passamaquoddy, all the names of now, like these names are for beaches and neighborhoods in New England. But before, they were tribes of people, real live living people who were killed by the English because they wanted to be there. And we meant little or nothing because we were associated with the devil. We're devil guys. It doesn't matter. God's gonna say, you did a good thing when you wiped out a bunch. So, around 1740, typhoid fever up in Nova Scotia almost completely wiped out the Micmac people. Just typhoid. 1763, a guy named Jeffrey Amherst. Anybody ever remember him from when we were in school studying history? Jeffrey Amherst was the English general who was in command of British troops at that time in North America. He was a big shot. And today there's Amherst College out in Massachusetts. It's all named for him. In 1763, a thing happened. Pontiac, not the car, the guy, went on the warpath against the English. And the English were so upset because they figured that, you know, we've always been kind of looked at as kind of a bunch of dumb guys that live out in the woods. But Pontiac pulled off a coordinated attack on 12 different English forts within 2 days' time of all those attacks. Isn't that something? I mean, for the time to be able to do that, and that, you know, they didn't have any radios or cell phones, they couldn't call each other or anything. They pulled that off in 1763. The English were so incensed that they put a hit out on Pontiac. And the guy that they used was a Peoria Indian. His name was Peony, which means turkey in our language. And he stabbed and tomahawked Pontiac down south in southern Illinois. And that gave rise to intertribal warfare, where it was Indian versus Indian. And part of that, if you ever heard of Starved Rock down on the Illinois River, that was all part of that whole deal. And that's kind of how the Potawatomi ended up here in this neck of the woods, because at that time the Miami Indians were really the guys that were controlling this area. But Ottawa Indians, Pontiac was in Ottawa. The Ottawa Indians, some Ojibways, Menominees, Potawatomis, they all got together this because Pontiac was a real leader of men, a very, super intelligent guy. And it incensed them that he was killed. So here they come down the river or down the lake, and they get down here closer to Chicago. They run into the Miamis and they say, "Hey, come on, we're going to go down and get the Illinois guy that killed Pontiac." And the Miamis kind of go, "No, we live kind of close to those guys. I don't know if we want to go." And they basically said to them, "Either you come with us, or when we get done down there, we're coming back here, and you're next on the hit list." And they did. And in the meantime, the Miami booked out of the Chicago area and went down into Indiana and got out of harm's way. Well, when all these guys come back from that, they land here in this area and they start to spread out in this area. Okay, back to Jeffrey Amherst. There's a siege going on at Fort Pitt, which is Pittsburgh today. And the commander there, a captain, is perturbed because they got this siege going. And he gets word to Amherst that this is going on. And Amherst knows that there's smallpox at that fort. So he sends a guy back, a dispatch guy, and says, "Give the Indians your blankets and handkerchiefs from the typhoid hospital, or the smallpox hospital." Not only does he just say that, but he writes an order. Writes him an order. That was the first written order for germ warfare that there was. That order gets back there, and they do that, and those blankets go back to the different tribes that were assembled. I mentioned a lot of the guys that followed Pontiac. Potawatomis, Menominees, Winnebagos, they're all there. And they end up bringing that back. And it just decimated the woodland people. The Revolutionary War times were really bad news. One little quick thing. Amherst College, I said, that was named after Jeff. Up to 1970, they served meals there on bone china that was made in the 1800s. Their fancy dinners. And on those dinner plates, it showed English horsemen with drawn swords chasing Indians. 1970, they finally thought better of it and pulled the plates. Documented, there's pictures. So anyway, the Revolutionary War times come, and that creates a big problem because, again, it becomes tribal warfare, one tribe against another tribe, because the English have made some tribes their friends, and Americans have made other tribes their friends, and the French had made other tribes their friends. There was a guy named Francis Parkman. He was like an 18th or 19th century historian who said that the Spanish conquered the Indians, the English looked on them with disdain, and the French embraced them. And that was the case in my family. On our Potawatomi side, there's as many crazy little French Voyager guys as there is Indians. And they had to be little guys, those Voyagers. You know what I'm talking about? The Voyagers paddled the canoes with the trade goods and then took the furs back, and they paddled all the way out to the end of the St. Lawrence and loaded those on ships that went back to Europe because they were making hats out of beaver fur. Real important industry. For 500 years in Europe, the best hats to wear were beaver fur hats. They trapped most of their beaver out, and all of a sudden there was this big source here in North America, and so that became the coin of the realm. You ever hear the term mad as a hatter? Okay. They would take these bundles of furs, usually they weighed about 80, 90 pounds. They would load them into canoes, and that's why you had to be a small guy. You couldn't be a big guy. A big guy like me, they wouldn't hire me because I would take up too much room in the canoe and not leave enough room for the furs and stuff. So back in Europe, they take these furs and they mix them with chemicals, and what they're really after is not the hair, they're after the wool that's down in the furs. And if you ever see a beaver fur, you know what I'm talking about. So that's what makes the good hats. But these guys are working feverishly because on Sundays, the women would go to church with their new hats and ride around in carriages and show them off. And the men had the 3 tri-corner hats and all that stuff. Well, so here's these hatters. They're using stuff like arsenic, mercury, all this stuff, and they're working 7 days a week, going just head over heels, making money. But in the meantime, all these chemicals are eating their brain away. And that's where the term mad as a hatter came from. Anyway, I'm sorry, I apologize. So there was a lot of different reasons why during the Revolutionary War the different tribes sidled up with the other people. Some of it was loyalties brought by annuities, trade items, intermarriages. We even had guys that would, at that time it became popular for the people who are running things to send out peace medals. And peace medals were usually about that big around. It had the picture of whoever was in charge. You know, like for the English, there might be an English general on it. For Americans, there was Washington and Jefferson and those guys on these medals. That's how they got loyalty, because Indians were, hey, that's cool. You know, yeah, we'll hang around with you guys. That's a pretty cool medal. And so, you know, alliances were made with all kinds of crazy stuff. Both European and American alliances, of course, would result in the destruction of villages and whole peoples. New York State was like a lightning rod throughout the French and Indian War and the Revolutionary War for action against Indians and by Indians against other Indians. 1782, Christian Delaware Indians were massacred by Americans in Ohio. And these were Christians. First time that a bunch of Indians that were Christian, they decided they were in the way and they massacred. Interestingly enough, it wasn't just us. The Russians were messing with the people out in the northwest and had incursions out there. But the biggie that happened here didn't happen until 1830. And that was when a guy named Andrew Jackson became president. Andrew Jackson, in the history of the American Indian, killed more Native people than any of these other things I've been talking about. And the way he did it was through what was called the Indian Removal Act. Anybody ever hear that?
Yes.
The Indian Removal Act. Sometimes when I say that, people look at me and go, nah, they didn't do that. Yeah, they did. They rounded our families up, sometimes at the point of a bayonet, loaded them into wagons if they were lucky, sometimes made them walk through different times of the year. They endured sickness, no food, poor transportation, exposure, and people died along the way. The idea was to get the Indians, I said before, out of sight, out of mind. This time, we're going to get rid of them for good. George Washington had this theory in his mind that Indians, we could civilize them. That's the other thing. We're not civilized people. I hope you don't mind. But Washington wanted to civilize and then bring all the Indians together. Andrew Jackson didn't. He hated Indians. And that goes back to his childhood. So as a result of him hating Indians, he comes up with the Indian Removal Act. We're going to send them all west of the Mississippi River unless they've already signed an agreement to stay on a reservation that's out of our way. Manifest destiny. Here we go again. So there's this big rush by the government to get Indians to sign away their land because that's what Andy Jackson wants. An interesting thing happened at that time. The Supreme Court was, the Cherokee people went to the Supreme Court with that case, with that law, and challenged it in the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court agreed with them that it was unconstitutional, it was genocide, it was, all these things. And they told Andrew Jackson, can't do it. He said, yeah, I can. I'm the president. I don't care what those guys say. First time in American history where a president defied the Supreme Court. So the removal was on. In our family, by this time, some of the Frenchmen had married Potawatomis down in southern Illinois, southern Indiana. And as a result of that, when the removal time came, they all got together and said, let's just go to Canada. They'll leave us alone. And they did. That's how our family. But when our family came back in 1864, it was still against the law for them to be up in northern Wisconsin. As late as 1840, they were still doing roundups. They were going around in the woods up there, and the military was doing it, and they were rounding up any Indians that they found, and they were sending them out to Kansas and Iowa and stuff. The Potawatomi up there didn't get a what they did was they started coming back. They'd sneak back, and they'd hide out. And for a while, they were known as the strolling band of Potawatomi, or the Potawatomi Gypsies. And the sheriff occasionally would run onto them, and if he did and was able to catch some, he caught them and got a reward from the government. In 1912, the Potawatomi up there were granted a reservation. But what they did when they granted the reservation was they made it like a checkerboard affair. They didn't want to have them too close together because they might make trouble. So today, you still can look at the layout and see that it's like this. Ray knows, he's been up there.
Yeah, actually there was if you don't mind me saying, there was a Catholic priest that was helping them, and he bought them a bunch of land, some portion of them in that checkerboard, and then they lost it, and then they got enough money up again, and like Rebellia's like in the Stone Lake area or something, that was
Yes.
bought by a Catholic priest for.
Yeah, there was a Baptist guy up
Maybe he
there
was
too,
Baptist.
that did a lot to buy land and help them out up there too. But they were like really poor people, and our people, my family, came back down, and they kept on the move. They moved all over up through the North Woods, and the first time that they showed up on any census was like in 1910 or something like that over in Marinette. So they were just staying. They were running all the time, moving.
How many people were in the,
How many were up there in that band?
Came back.
It varies. It varied because people would come and go. I think that there was, as I recall, there was something like 400 people at the time that they made that a reservation.
How many were there before the removal?
Well, before the removal, we were like 6,000 people. We were one of the most powerful tribes in the Midwest. And the reason for that, there's a whole bunch of reasons for it, but not to oversimplify it, but a lot of it had to do with French trade. We got all hooked up with the French traders and became kind of like middlemen who were willing to go like to Hudson Bay and places like that and bring back furs, and then take the trade goods back ourselves and say, hey, we started being traders. But to go back to technological leaps were taking place. We were more farmers. Okay, a lot of people sell Indians short here because we were farmers. Right today, in a lot of the, what we call bundles are special treasures of clans and families and so forth that are still all tied up in little bundles. And today they're opening those up and they're finding seeds that they're regenerating from back, 100, 150-year-old seeds. So we were farmers before the removal, more than we were hunter-gatherer type people. When we started this program out with these European guys, we were hunter-gatherer agrarian people, but as a result of that, we had to keep moving. Your winter camp was where you broke up in a small group to hunt and fish. You came out in the spring at this time to Sugar Bush. That's where you made your maple sugar, because that was the only seasoning that we had. Then from there, it would be go to gardens and plant your fields, your crops. And so you had this sort of movement where they moved around all the time. But as we had more contact with Europeans and got more stuff from them, we led a more and more sedentary life. When you don't have to go out and peel birch bark to make your pot to cook your food, when you can use that same one over and over again, life is good. So we hit the high mark where we spread out. We were in Michigan, we were in Wisconsin,